Okay.
Where am I now?
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming here. This is um, the first edition. Like, can I say that for of our permanent seminar during the academic year of 2023. The permanent seminar of legal history at the Federal University of Ceará is it's a seminar I have been organizing since 2019 or 2018, I guess. Many important scholars from different parts of the world came to the conference. I mean, virtually, because as you all know, the situation of Brazilian education and research is a little bit complicated. I think we are gonna be we're gonna have better days right now, but we faced some troubled years, including my dear friend Luis Estela was one of the first participants of this conference 4 years ago. And this time, for the opening conference of this season, we have here Professor Heikki Pihlajamäki. He's professor of legal history and comparative legal history at the University of Helsinki. He's the organizer, responsible for the Cocoa Law Project. I think Cocoa Law Project is one of the most interesting research projects in legal history. I think nowadays, they have a pretty good team. Many Brazilians there, including some friends. They're doing an excellent work, and I'm very excited about the following results and following publications. And then many of our students know quite well the works of Professor Pihlajamäki. Particularly, he's very well known here, particularly due to a paper he published in 2015, I guess, in the Revista Sequência about comparative legal history. And dealing with global history and so on. So it's very good to have you here, Heikki. It's excellent for us to hear you. I think we what we do here, it's just you can talk as much as as you can. I mean, feel free, 30, 40, 50 minutes. I think it's good. And then we normally open the floor for questions and so on. I think if it's okay for you, I guess an hour and a half, it will be good. I mean, if I think it's okay if you say so. So thank you so much. You're allowed to share also the presentation. And I need to say that Professor Pihlajamäki he speaks pretty good Portuguese. I heard him a couple of times speaking Portuguese. I'm not sure if I already told you, but in 2018 at the annual conference of the American Society for Legal History, we were talking with many people there, and I heard Professor Pihlajamäki speaking different languages, Dutch, Swedish, and English, German. And then he turned to me and he spoke Portuguese, and then I was scared. This guy is prodigious with languages. So I think if you have any questions, I think you can do it in Portuguese. And then if Professor Pihlajamäki needed, I can help with the translation. But I think it would be good to understand also. So thank you so much, Heikki.
Okay, thank you, Gustavo. Yes, of course. You can ask questions in Portuguese. I should actually be speaking Portuguese as well, but I guess I was a little bit too lazy to prepare the thing in Portuguese, because it always does take a little bit more work to do it that way. So I'm not going to do it now. I'll just speak in English this time. Okay, so I'll try to share my my screen. Let's see how it works. Okay. Oh, okay, so that's the way it goes. Do you see it? Can you
Not
see
yet.
it?
Yeah. Now we can.
No. All right. Great. Then I'll just start. And thank you, Gustavo, for the nice introduction. What I'm going to talk about today is some conceptual things, which, at least for me, have been sort of uh, topical right now. I've been thinking about these things quite a lot for several reasons. So I thought I would share some of these thoughts with you. I will not speak so much about our project, but something a little bit anyway. So I will just go right on to the to the to the concepts that I'm going to talk about. I'll start with colonial law. This, of course, is a very, very difficult concept, as all of these are, actually. You have many different kind of definitions for each of them. It's also anachronistic, this one, colonial law, obviously. During the early modern period, at least when we talk about that, maybe end of the 19th century, it might not be that anachronistic anymore. But I'm dealing with the early modern period here mainly, so one can easily say that it's anachronistic because in the early modern period, they did not talk about colonial law nowhere in the world. Colonial legal history is something that grew from the beginning of the 20th century onwards. Spain and the Spanish world was that. Ricardo Leve know the basics Indiano Spanish colonial law, so I need not reiterate that here. Having works also on British legal history and then quite a lot later in Portuguese legal history, Dutch legal history, and so forth. What all these legal histories share with each other traditionally is that they are extensions of national legal histories, I should say. So national legal histories, we are sure with all kinds of nationalisms. So we start having at least nothing else than national legal history in the 19th century, except for certain exceptions. We have universal legal history as well, Edward Guns and that type of things, but there are exceptions. So it's kind of logical that once we start having colonial legal histories or legal historians doing colonial legal history, what they call colonial legal history, it's from the national point of view that they do that. They do not compare with anything. That's what I mean. Because if you were, for instance, a British legal historian in the beginning of the 20th century, the 1950s, 60s, or whatever, you were not interested in continental legal history. If you were a Finnish legal historian, you were not interested in anything else than Finnish legal history, maybe Swedish legal history, because it's practically the same thing for 700 years. But it's really like that. Germans as well, not to talk about the French. So everybody basically has been national legal historian. And I would say that maybe 60, 70% of legal history is still that way. So it's no wonder that colonial legal history can quite well be said to be part of this same kind of a tradition. This doesn't apply for colonial history, of course. Colonial history has become much more universalized much earlier than colonial legal history. So why should we? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with colonial legal history as an extension of national legal history? Well, the same things that are wrong with national legal histories as well, if you do them very narrow-mindedly. Comparing colonial laws is necessary, I think, because of the, let's say, classical reasons why you do comparisons. You identify similarities and differences quite simply. you can question, and you should question, exceptionalisms as well. What does that mean? Questioning exceptionalisms. Well, all of the legal histories tend to develop certain things that they sort of like label as exceptional. You always read in the works of Derecho Indiano, for instance, that Derecho Indiano is casuistic, that it's typical for Derecho Indiano, Spanish colonial law, that it's casuistic. Of course, it's casuistic. That's not wrong, but it's not typical for and only Spanish legal history, because practically all colonial law was very casuistic at that time in the early modern period. So it's not an exceptional feature of Spanish legal history, Spanish colonial law, to be casuistic. Just to take one example. So colonial law, we will get back to that, what I mean really by it. We didn't really arrive at any kind of a definition yet. Composite states, which I think is kind of like some kind of a beginning here, and probably known to all of you. I hope I'm not boring you very much. It starts with Jorge Königsberger in the 70s, when he sort of like coined the term of a composite state, saying that it's referring to, and I'm quoting him, most states in the early modern period were composites, including more than one country under the sovereignty of one ruler. So this is the definition of a composite state. There's more than one country, as he says, under the sovereignty of one ruler. Then a Swedish historian, Harald Gustafsson, came forth a couple of about 20 years after Königsberger with the term conglomerate state, which is actually the same thing. It's very difficult to see any big difference between these two terms, so they can almost be used as synonyms of one another. There's one difference maybe when you read these two articles. You can what Harald Gustafsson emphasizes very much is that he thinks that the conglomerate state was the type of early modern state, meaning that every state was a conglomerate state in the early modern period and in Europe, and because he's talking about Europe as is Königsberger mainly. So, and I think he's right. It's very difficult really to find any state in early modern Europe which would not be a conglomerate state or a composite state. If we exclude, let's say, if we take all the colonies into this definition, then it's definitely true. But if let's make kind of a play and disregard the colonies, if we only think about the continental countries of Europe in the early modern period, so I can easily think of only one exception, maybe, which would be Portugal. But I don't know if I'm even right in that, because Algarve, of course, had a special situation. The kings were also kings of Algarve, even though I guess that didn't really mean anything in practice. But so even there, this kind of idea of a composite state is somehow present, and then all the other ones are definitely like that. And I have a couple of examples here of what it meant in practice, not so well known to you, I think, so that's why I actually took it. Sweden, to make an example, Sweden in the 17th century included Sweden proper, as we tend to say, and that includes Finland at that time. So Sweden and Finland were sort of like inseparable under one law when we talk about law. Then German influenced one Livonian legal system, which also had its own legal order. Actually, many of them, because they're systems. So it was really a very pluralistic system in both Estonia and Livonia. Then you had German territories after the piece of West territories within the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. You had about, I don't know how many languages you had in Sweden at that time. You had at least Swedish, Finnish, German, Ingrian, which is a Finnish-related language, still a little bit spoken around the area of St. Petersburg. You had Estonian, you had Livonian, which is now dead. The last speaker died, I think, about 20 years ago. You had Danish, you had Norwegian, and you had about something like, rough guess, 10 different Sami languages in Lapland. Some of them are nowadays dead, but many still are alive. So instead of having just one Sami language, for instance, in Finland, you have 3 of them, which are not mutually comprehensible, by the way. And each one of them has something like from 500 to 10,000 speakers. So they're very, very small languages up there. Anyway, this was just to show that this was the norm in the early modern period, that states were like this, and Sweden was not particularly heterogeneous when it came to languages or legal systems or nations or whatever. This was a typical way that the early modern state was sort of like set up. Then we have the case of Finland, which is of course very close to me, and it's kind of an interesting story because Finland was annexed to Russia, the Russian Empire, as one of the results of the Napoleonic Wars, as a Grand Duchy in 1809. So up till then, it had been part of Sweden. Now it passes on as a result of the wars to Russia. And what the Tsar, Alexander I, said when he sort of like accepted the Finnish estates under his scepter, he said these famous words that he wanted to raise Finland to the status of a nation among nations. This was very important for the Finns, especially then towards the end of the 19th century. It was repeated over and over again. Everybody knows it, even up to this day, that Alexander I was so nice that he really made Finland a nation among nations. And from this, it was then deduced that Finland was an autonomous land because it kept its laws from the Swedish period. It was never Russified. Well, this is true. It kept its laws all through the 19th century up to the independence in 1917. So Finland was a nation among nations. It was an autonomous land. You can still read in the history books in Finland that it's the 19th century is really the period of autonomy. Now, what's wrong with this? Obviously, this is a very nationalistic way of understanding history writing. But the way I see it is that Finland was actually the last case of annexing a territory in Europe within the model of a composite state. Nothing else. It was a typical way of how these conquests were made in Europe up till the 19th century. This is the last case. Autonomy is something that was then sort of like invented afterwards at the end of the 19th century, when there were more troubles with the Russians, Russification periods, which were not very successful, but they attempted it anyway. And Finland wanted to, at that point, sort of like the Finnish lawyers, especially, and politicians, wanted to emphasize that Finland was autonomous. It was not just any piece of the Russian Empire. This thing about nation among nations is interesting because there just appeared a book by Kristiina Kalleinen, a Finnish historian, who quite convincingly proves in the book that what Alexander really meant was that Finland received the same status as all the other nations within the Russian Empire, like Poland, for instance, or the Baltic nations or whatever. So nothing more really, just a nation among, let's say, Russian imperial nations, not as a nation among all the nations of the world or something like that. which was the way that the Finns liked to interpret this. Well, anyway, so that was the last case of a composite state. Now, as to the legal historical part of this, legal pluralism, are these always cases of legal pluralism? The composite states. Well, if you look at them at the level of the whole composite state, obviously, for instance, Sweden had many legal systems within it. But what does that help really to call it legal pluralism? I don't know. I'm not too crazy about the term legal pluralism in general. And for instance, if you look at Sweden, you have many parts with different legal systems. But for instance, Finland, which continued having its own system within Russia, was not particularly pluralistic. It had its own system, which was the same as the Swedish one, which was not particularly pluralistic. Okay, Livonian system was very pluralistic, and some of the other ones, but not all of them were. So you have to look at the different parts of a composite state to see what all kinds of legal systems you have enforced there. And that's the concept of legal pluralism is not really, it helps us sort of like but it's not a very good tool in analyzing these situations. But I'm getting back to that at the end of the presentation. Here's still a picture, by the way, of Sweden, and then we will go to other things, so you get some kind of an idea where we are here. So this is the dark green is the Sweden proper, as I mentioned, and then you have the different acquisitions from different periods. Here you have Estonia up there below Finland, and then you have Livonia below that, Ingria, and some parts of Denmark and Norway, and then the German territories down here on both sides of Denmark and so forth. All right, let's go to empires. That's an equally difficult term. Of course, you have some empires have emperors, but not all of them, and that's not any kind of a definition. You have Rome, which had an emperor during imperial times. You have Holy Roman Empire, which obviously had an emperor as well. You had Napoleon, and then you had Russia, which also had an emperor, and one might say that it still does, because that's obviously one of the theories about the Russian situation is that Putin is really sort of like thinking of himself as some kind of a successor of the Russian emperors, owing his power only to God and not to his people, which explains quite a lot of things going on in that terrorist country. Excuse my expression, but being here at the border makes one kind of strict about these things. An empire, according to Michael Chodorkovsky, is something which requires a political structure in which one dominating entity conquers and rules the other. So it's basically, according to Chodorkovsky, it's enough to have two, one that conquers another one. That's kind of a narrow definition, I think. But that's the way he defines it anyway. By the way, Michael Chodorkovsky should not be mixed up with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is the Russian oligarch, very much anti-Putin, who sat in jail for something like 10 years and is now exiled in Switzerland. This is not the same guy. This guy is, if somebody's familiar with chess, Michael Chodorkovsky is not the chess master with the same name, also in the United States. This Michael Chodorkovsky is of Ukrainian descent, but has been in the US for practically all of his career, I think. So a very prominent researcher of Russian history, and also has written interesting things, which at least somehow touch legal history as well. Then you have the famous book by Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper over the empires in world history, where they define empires as large political units, expansionist or with a memory of power extended over space, polities that maintain distinction and hierarchy as they incorporate people. So they are large for one thing. They cannot be small. What is large? Well, that's of course depends on who's answering the question. They are expansionist. They have this idea of expanding, or at least they have a memory of power. They sort of like, maybe they're not trying to expand right now, but they have this idea of themselves as expanding nations. They remember having once expanded, something like that. And they have also some kind of a hierarchical system within the empire. If we take Russia, for instance, now or during the times of the Tsar, it's quite evident that it's really the actual Russia which has been dominating over the other peoples in that country. The same goes, of course, for the classical maritime empires: Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Britain, which I would call the classical empires. They're all maritime empires as well, as against land-based empires, of which there's, of course, a whole lot. Again, Russia, you have China, you have Ottoman Empire, and whatnot. There are many of them. So what is really important here, one might ask, is it the size of an empire? Well, I guess it matters. Was Sweden an empire? Well, many people would say no. Some would say yes. It's kind of small to be an empire, but it was, of course, expanding very much during the modern period. Until it started to shrink in the 17th century, 18th century, sorry. And there was a hierarchy, some kind of a hierarchy at least, between the different parts of the Swedish composite state or hierarchy. So this is something that is quite difficult to determine once and for all. And you can find different researchers calling different composite states empires. One thing is for sure, that the empire it must always be a composite state, otherwise it doesn't work. So this at least is clear. But okay, yeah. Then we will move on to colonialism. Another difficult term again. Colony. Well, in the 15th and 16th centuries, as Peter Kane and Mark Harrison define, back then it was what was referred to was really a plantation of settlers, which had, by definition, a considerable number of European immigrants. Then coming to the 19th century, the definition changes a little bit. You start talking about especially African and Asian acquisitions of the European powers as empires, regardless of whether they actually were settled by the conquering countries or not. But in the 15th, 16th century, they were usually settled to some extent at least. And Jürgen Osterhammel, the German writer of universal history, whom I respect very much, says that colonialism has to do with a political organization which is created by invasion, either conquest or settlement, but built on pre-colonial conditions. Its alien rulers are, according to Osterhammel, in sustained dependence on a geographically remote, it has to be far away, mother country or imperial center, which claims exclusive rights of possession of the colony. So it's always the in a colonial arrangement, the mother country is always, according to Osterhammer, a little bit far, preferably maybe over the ocean or something like that. Colonialism obviously carries some kind of a moral aspect to it. It's something inherently not desirable, something bad. There's economic subjugation involved, often a cultural or racial distinction. And sorry to return again to Russia. I can't just referring to it. I can't help referring to it every once in a while here, but I think it offers such good examples. During the Soviet Union time, the Soviet Union, according to their history writing, was obviously not colonial, because colonialism was bad. It was a term reserved to the capitalist evil nations. It had nothing to do with the history of Russia, or not to talk about the Soviet Union itself, because the peoples that had joined even the Tsarist Russia or the Soviet Union had done it supposedly voluntarily, because it was such a nice idea to join the happy family of the Tsarist Empire or the Soviet Union. So does colonialism always mean that there's a geographical remoteness, as Jürgen Osterhammer claims? No, I don't think so. I think Russia might as well be called a colonial empire. This is what Michał Khodorkovsky also says. He thinks that there's no real difference. I mean, why should an ocean, for instance, make a decisive difference? I don't really see why. The term is usually reserved for European empires only. We don't really talk about colonialism, although there are, of course, all kinds of researchers, but most researchers sort of like narrow it down to European originated empires who subjugate other people for economic benefit, or usually involved in some kind of a cultural, maybe racial distinctions as well. Then we still have imperialism, of course, which complicates this even more. I think Robert Young, in his Empire, Colony, Post-Colony book, makes quite a sort of like deals with this problem quite well by saying that imperialism usually refers to a state policy, hard or soft power over the countries being imperialized. It doesn't really mean that these countries would necessarily be colonized by people. It can be, especially in today's world, also done by other means. Whereas then, and it's usually operating from the center. That's the idea. There's some kind of a center which operates the imperialist state policy, which also often has financial traits to it, whereas colonialism includes some kind of an invasion. Typically, of course, this can overlap, and in practice might be a little bit difficult to separate from one another. Anyway, so this is more or less a few definitions of about 500 which exist in the research literature. I have to say again that I'm trying to be practical. I'm actually doing this for myself. I'm trying to find out what I'm really thinking about these terms that I've always thought that are more or less clear, because I sort of like felt the need. Colonial empires. What are they then? Well, conquests always produce empires, but not all empires are colonial. Obviously, we have empires that are not colonial, such as, for instance, Holy Roman Empire. It was not colonial. It was an empire, but it was not colonial, obviously. And then you have classic maritime empires, which we already talked about, but really also then Russia, and you have what I would also call empires, even though small ones. Sweden we already talked about, and then Denmark as well, obviously. There is it's not a very good map, but I hope you can get some kind of an idea. The idea here is that Denmark also in the 17th and 18th centuries had all kinds of colonies all over the place. The little Denmark is there below Norway, and Norway was part of that. Also, the Svalbard Islands up there in the north, Iceland, Greenland, and in between the Faroe Islands, which don't really even show on the map. And then they had 3 little islands in the Caribbean, Saint Croix, Saint Thomas, and the third one, which I don't never remember the name. There's a small area that Denmark actually got from or took from the Swedes in Western Africa, where there's that violet dot there. It's more or less where today's Ghana is. It's called the Gold Coast, and then there are trading posts also in Asia, in India, more or less. So it was definitely an expanding empire, even though quite a small one. But empire. And by the way, talking about law again, there was Danish colonial law as well. My colleague from the University of Copenhagen, who's now retired, Ditlev Tam, has actually written a couple of articles about Danish colonial law in the Caribbean islands. Okay, then on to colonial law. We're getting closer to law. What is it really? Well, obviously many things. Starting from España, whom you all know very well. One of his ideas that I think are quite illuminating really is that jus commune, both secular and ecclesiastic, served as a framework for legal pluralism, leaving open and indeterminate legal spaces, as he says, for different kinds of legal arrangements, normativities, as Thomas Dewey would say. This structure was basically the same in Europe and in all the colonies. There's really no difference. The same jus commune structure allowed for many different kinds of arrangements, and it was the same all over the place in Europe and in America, for instance. And also, one could say that it was the same for France. It was the same for the United Provinces as well. For the Netherlands, that is more or less the same kind of a structure worked, for instance, in Indonesia, where you have special legislation for Batavia, for what is now Indonesia, and you had then, if you did not find the answer in those in the rules that were specifically given for Dutch East Indies, then you had to take recourse to the Dutch law. So basically, it was very much the same way as was done, for instance, in the Spanish colonies or the Portuguese ones. Now, getting back a little bit to pluralism, which I said that it is not a very well functioning tool when you think about these complicated systems. Well, first of all, because España's idea about the jus commune is also a good idea, but it doesn't get us very far either. It's sort of like the framework, but then what? Well, Thomas has come up with this idea of historical regimes of normativity, which at least Louisa has worked with, I'm sure, quite a lot. And it's a complicated theory, and I'm not going through it here. I strongly advise that if you haven't read that article, which is there on the slide, please do. It's really very, very thought provoking. He says that historical regimes of normativity are a form of observation of stabilized arrangements of knowledge of normativity in relation to a particular field of action. This is the definition in a nutshell, and then he uses the whole 30 or 40 pages or whatever it is to sort of like open up this complicated a definition, but it's really worthwhile, and I think it's a very, very intriguing concept, one must say. He talks about stabilized arrangements, so not just any arrangements. They have to have some kind of stability in order to be worth the while of researching. He talks about knowledge of normativity. There's a separate article, by the way, on that subterms, so to say, about what it means, what is knowledge of normativity. Different kinds of normativities, all kinds of normativities that in some ways steer human lives, not just laws, but also ethical rules and principles and whatever, that type of things, and how knowledge is produced on these different normativities. And then he very practically, actually, practically mindedly, sort of like says that it should always be, these ideas should be applied to a particular field of action. So not to everything once and at the same time, but to a particular field of social action. So this is already to one has to look at a particular place, a particular action, to see what kind of normativities are at work in that particular action, field of action, in that particular place. So I think it's very good. Is global comparison of colonial laws then possible if we follow, especially Thomas Duve's idea of historical regimes of normativity, which is really very localized, so to say. It's a very local system, referring to the project where Luisa is active, because I've understood that they really look at the very local level, following this type of thinking. Can we then do some kind of global comparisons? Well, I'm sure we can. Especially if we have enough of these localized research projects already, and we have results which can be compared, then it's definitely possible. We also can do that if we raise the level of abstraction, or if we take different perspectives of comparison, which allow for it. And this is actually what we are doing in comparing colonial laws in the COCOLO project. We are looking at a particular perspective on how normative governance is done over the world in the different colonial legal systems. How people are steered, what kind of knowledge, if you want to use that term, of normativity is produced by way of colonial law. And the whole idea is really that colonial law, much of it, not all of it, of course, not all of the normativities at work in the colonies, but much of it is actually the same as police regulation, jus politiae, Polizeirecht, at the same time work in Europe. So this is where the casuistic regulation actually comes from. It's typically police regulation. This is why the Spanish legal historians, the historians of Derecho Indiano, say that Spanish colonial law is so casuistic. It's casuistic because it's police regulation. It's the same thing, basically. It's all kinds of nitty-gritty regulation that has to do with organizing a modern society, especially urban society, but other kinds of societies as well. Well, it's trade regulation, it's sanitary regulation, it's health regulation, it's all kinds of commercial regulation, all kinds of security regulation, and so forth and so forth. This is what Derecho Indiano is about. This is what colonial law is about all over the place in every colonial legal system, and that's really mostly what it is. Of course, as I said, there are other normativities at work in the colonies as well, always. So we have to look at the colonial law as police regulation in context of these other normativities. You have jus commune or Roman law in the field of private law. You have different kinds of indigenous laws. You have customary laws, which are not the same as indigenous laws always. They are also, there can be customary laws which are developed by the Europeans. You have treaties, an interesting part of colonial law as well. By the way, you have canon law, obviously, and then you have all kinds of royal legislation, which is pretty difficult to categorize as police regulation, which is sort of like higher level legislation, but may still apply in colonial contexts as well. So you have all kinds of normativities, but much of the typically colonial, what we typically conceive of as colonial law is really, that's my claim, is really more or less police regulation. So what can we find out if we make these comparisons? Well, I'm not going to that deep, mostly because I don't know yet. we're working on it. Let's say, put it that way. It's a work in progress very much. But some of the ideas I think are quite clear already. There's 3 examples of what things are similar in the different colonial legal orders, meaning in this case, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and I would also say the French, even though I don't really know it that well, legal orders. They're very similar, and these 3 examples, I mean, the statute theory of law, which is more or less the same as what Antonio Manuel España is talking about. The idea, the medieval originated idea, theoretically idea from Europe, which means that when you're facing a legal problem, you should always depart from the most local legal source. So it may be a town law. If you don't find the answer to your problem there, you go to the next sphere of law. So to say, in Europe, it might be some kind of a princely legal statute or customary law. And if that doesn't provide the answer, you might go to the royal law. And then at the end of the day, if nothing else helps, then you go to jus commune. This, by the way, was also this kind of statute theory of law was written into legislation in many places of Europe. For instance, in Sweden, when they conquered Livonia in the 1630s, they made a law about how the different statutes were to be used, and it was really an application of this general jus commune statute theory of law. The same applied very much, of course, also in the German Empire. In theory, in practice, it's always a different thing. I made a study on Livonia myself, and Peter Östman, our colleague from Münster, has made a great study on the Holy Roman Empire, on how this theory was really practiced in legal praxis, and the practice looks in both of these places very different from the theory. But in theory, this was the case in Europe, and it was also the case in all of these colonies that I mentioned. A little bit differently, but also something that all these systems seem to share is that indigenous laws are typically categorized as customary law. This is how they are sort of like taken into the system. They are treated as customary law, which means certain things, again, in the European tradition, for instance, that they have to be proven, that they are sort of like subservient to the other laws and that type of things. And as I already mentioned, one similarity is that they are all of these systems mentioned are police regulation. England is, you might ask, how does the British legal history, British colonial law fit this scheme? Now that's a good question. At least they have police regulation, that's for sure. Because when the for instance, when the North American colonies were colonized in the 17th century. You can imagine the situation when if you try to implant a common law system into surroundings where you have no lawyers. It doesn't work, because common law is very much, and was already back then, very much dependent on legal professionals. If you did not have them, you could not really have a common law system, not at least a full-blown common law system. You could have a simplified version, which is what they had, and then what you are very likely to use, as they did, was then written laws, which were practically the same as police regulation, which also, by the way, England had. If you want to have, for instance, sanitary measures, rules on sanitary measures in the urban surroundings, they're a little bit difficult to create by way of common law. It's much easier to have statutes on those things. So England at least partly shares this same features. Dissimilarities are then another thing, and I'm not getting into them in this presentation. And then I'm approaching the end. I think it's about time anyway. Global legal history, what is that? Well, as I've written in other contexts, if you read the article in Sequencia, more or less, I think I said it there already. I think that all legal history, at least in the broad sense, is comparative. There is nothing else than comparative legal history. So we might as well not talk about comparative legal history anymore, because all legal history is comparative. That's my idea. It's comparative in the sense that even though it might not be classically comparative, comparing A to B, that type of comparisons, or comparing systematically different colonial legal systems, that's definitely comparative. But it's also, all legal history is comparative, or should be comparative, in the sense that if we're making a study on a national legal system, which is fine, of course, you should be at least aware of its sort of like connections to broader circles, because such connections always exist. No national legal history can be understood completely outside its international context. So in that sense, all legal history is and should be comparative. Global legal history, what is that then? Well, that's a big subject to go into, and I will not. Thomas Due, by the way, has written an excellent article about that as well. There are many ways, of course, of understanding global legal history. It's all legal history which has some global connections. It might be local legal history with global connections or entanglements between different local or regional or national legal systems. In practice, what is, and this is not a normative statement, but it's a practical observation, is that often global legal history tends to deal with European originated institutions and normativities, maybe then within their non-European surroundings, but there's very little global legal history which would have nothing to do with European originated institutions. That's my observation, not a normative statement, really. There is a reason for it, which is that even though we should, of course, always consider the local surroundings, it just happens to be a fact that it's really the European legal systems that have traveled worldwide, not the Chinese legal systems, not the Islamic legal systems, not the African legal systems. It's really the European systems that have sort of like conquered the world from a very early point on, and they still keep doing it. So it's no wonder that global legal history is difficult to do completely detached from European legal history. Truly comprehensively global legal histories have yet not been written, but undoubtedly they will in the coming years, at least, or at least decades. That's really all I had to say, and I'm happy to answer your questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Heikki. I mean, it was an excellent talk. I mean, I I took many notes, made many notes here of many points you've mentioned, and I think that's I mean I have some comments and questions, but I mean I think I'm gonna open firstly for anyone here. I mean that wishes to ask anything or made a comment. Or, I mean, and as I said previously, e como eu falei, eu vou até falar em português agora. O professor Heikki entende bem português, então, assim, à medida do possível, se quiserem fazer uma pergunta em português, pausadamente, acho que fica tranquilo e eu eventualmente posso, se for o caso, ajudar com alguma tradução, certo? Então,
E devagar, por favor, se vocês falam português, devagar. Não muito rápido.
Ainda bem que eu tô falando inglês também, porque eu falo tudo rápido. Damiro, fica à vontade. Damiro, então, se você puder também se apresente.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. First of all, thank you for the speech, Professor. My name is Delmiro Farias. I am in the PhD or doctorate in the UFC. I'm under the guidance of the Professor Cabral, and I have some questions. I think 2 questions, but it's some silly questions. I hope I get some answers. I will try to speak in English, and also to train my English. First of all, in the first question is in the did you said that in the early modern period the people did not use the colonial law, the term colonial law, because you said that, if I get it right, you said that it's some kind of anachronism because the people at the time that did not use this term. But my question is how did they treated the like for example the Portuguese example, how did the Portuguese government, the Kingdom of Portugal, treated the overseas territories if it's not colonial, with not colonial law? What they use they use their own law in the expansions, or they adapt their law? My question is, it's like the same law they applied, or some kind of different law adaptation of that the mother law in the empire? Sorry about the English. Next question I will ask in Portuguese.
No, it was a good question. Shall I answer right away? Okay.
I can make my second if you prefer.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
In the second question is, in the definition of Königsberger, you said that there is a empire. Composite state definition. My question is, the Iberic Union can be called a composite state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's for sure. I mean, I'll start with the last one. Yeah, obviously, the Iberian Union was a composite state under one crown, two nations, or actually, well, more. Portugal and Spain, and whatever went into Spain. So definitely. As to colonial law, well, yes, I mean, what I actually meant was that colonial law was not conceptualized as colonial law. This is the thing. There was, of course, legislation in all of these colonial empires which was meant for the colonies only, for particular colonies or for all of the colonies, depending on the case. But it was not. There was not such a sort of like area as colonial law separately from other colonial legal sort of like areas of law, which is quite understandable because you have these different rules also within Europe in these empires. So they treated the colonies really as such. As only an extension of Europe, to put it bluntly a little bit. Now, an interesting thing is that again I think there's one country only which really produced. Nevertheless, and this you might think that this goes a little bit against of what I just said, is the fact that there's one country which seems to have produced colonial legal scholarship, and that's Spain. Think about Solórzano Pereira, for instance. It was kind of a colonial. He didn't speak about Derecho Indiano, of course, but it was kind of a colonial legal scholarship, nevertheless. And you have some other ones, of course, as well, but only in Spain. Portugal did not produce that kind of legal scholarship. Neither did the Netherlands. Even though both of these countries had quite a lot of legal scholarship, especially in Netherlands, they, for some reason, were not at all interested in the colonial affairs. But Spain was. So you have this type of literature, which is again a special feature, I think, for Spain. Britain didn't do it either. You don't have really colonial literature until in the 19th century. But remember, I'm talking all the time about the early modern period. The 19th century is already a different story. But in the early modern period, I think it's really a Spanish specialty, kind of like. But then there were all kinds of specialized branches of literature anyway. Not even Solórzano Pereira talked about colonial law or Derecho Indiano or something like that. That was an invention of the 20th century only.
May I, Gustavo?
Sure, Luisa, sure.
Okay, hi, thank you so much. This is very interesting, and touch all the topics that are so dear to us, but at the same time so complicated complicated to work with when we are doing global legal history. So thanks a lot. It was very thoughtful. Well, I'm just going to dig a little bit more in the very basic concepts, because just for keep us talking a little bit more. You talked a little bit about, like you mentioned, Spain and its importance, for example, as the use common and how we could identify it in very different places. But I was thinking about like to ask you a little bit more to develop about the role of the local legal systems and its connection to customary law, what the historiography has built as customary law. So when we are doing, my question actually is about the definition of comparison, which is something that I have been thinking a lot about, because of course we have this whole historiography behind the definition of what is a comparative legal history, what is a comparative law. But so my question is about how are you dealing with the question of local legal systems, with the relation with customary law, and at the same time, what we are comparing here when we are talking about colonialism. So we have this, of course, we make this in the historiography, we have this differentiation, like we just heard the word the mother law coming from one place to another. And then we have something that is being built here. We try to call it colonial law, but it's resemble, or it's more or less the same or not. Sometimes we have same laws, sometimes we have different laws, sometimes we have something completely new. And at the same time, we have been discussing a lot about what is the role of this customary law, that we don't call it law because, of course, because of the influence of how legal history was built as a discipline, as a field of study, you know, this inheritance that we have from the nation state. So we keep, for me, we keep sometimes reproducing this idea that other laws are not laws, like we call it other things, customs, customer law, practices, and so on. So it was confusing. But yeah, so basically it's about the definition of comparison and the role of the local legal systems when we are comparing.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very, very good questions. It's not your question that was confusing. It's the whole subject, which cannot help being anything but confusing. Okay, well, about the comparisons. Well, I think I would just go by the general rules, more or less, of comparative law. You have to choose what you are comparing. You cannot compare everything. If you talk about comparing, let's say, different colonial legal systems, you have to choose your your comparisons. What are you comparing? We, for instance, we're comparing written laws, the police legal systems. That's our point of comparison. We are comparing them, and of course, in all kinds of contexts, which always makes it more difficult. But that's where the focus is anyway. It has its downsides, obviously, many downsides. Like all choices that you make have downsides. This has a downside that you might ask, as is always asked in Polizeirecht research in Europe as well, that were they observed? That you can ask. It's a legitimate question, and it's something that we probably will not be able to answer, which the Polizeirecht researchers in Europe usually don't answer either. It's another thing. This is the perspective that we choose. If you want to be really, really let's say, comprehensive, you need to go to the local level. And this is what, of course, the local people who do that like to say, that this is the only way of doing it. It's the law only exists at a local level. There is no other way of doing it. I don't quite believe that. Because that really ties us down to the little villages, to the local level only. And I don't think that can be the only way of doing comparisons. That's a legitimate way of doing comparisons. It's a wonderful way of doing comparisons, but it's not the only way of doing it. But it's a very good way of doing it. And then, of course, you run into the customary laws. Of course, also when you start dealing with them, you absolutely and unavoidably run into the problem of how to identify them. What kind of customary laws are you talking about? Again, depending on the place, are you talking about, for instance, court practices which are not written down? Are you talking about, let's say, the so-called wild customary law? This is the term by which Roy Garret uses in his book Consuetudo on the European customary law, which is something out there in the villages, supposedly, which kind of a legendary type of a customary law, which really never existed, because if it was actually practiced in courts, it had to go through the system of acceptance and so forth, or maybe it even had to be written down, which then makes the difference between customary laws and written laws a little bit hazy, and so forth and so forth. So these are the kind of choices that you have to make. What is your customary law? And then obviously you have the indigenous legal systems, which were conceptualized as in many places as customary legal systems. If they were, in order to be accepted, they had to be sort of like categorized as customary law. Then they of course needed to pass all the same tests as the customary legal systems in Europe. They had to be acceptable. They couldn't be against royal law. They had to be proven, and so forth and so forth. All these typical rules. So I don't know if this answered your question at all, but it was an attempt anyway.
I'm gonna read Edilson's question here. He wrote it on the chat. Use commonly involves more duties than rights.
Yeah. I saw that. Yeah, it's well, that's a very disputed question, because if you think about origin of rights, which is by no way my specialty, but well, I've read a little bit about it, and that's of course a very, very disputed question. Where do rights really originate from? There are researchers that date them all the way to ancient Rome. Then there are the traditional stories, of course, that they only arise after jus commune with enlightenment and so forth. And then there are some who place them in the Middle Ages, like Annabel Brett, for instance, Kenneth Pennington also partly. Kenneth Pennington, who writes on the Middle Ages, I think he says somewhere that, for instance, that the right to be summoned to court was actually a right. You could not be, according to the medieval legal theory, you could not be judged in a court unless you had been lawfully summoned to court. So that can then maybe be considered as a right already. But of course, again, if we talk about conceptualizing rights in lists of kind of like a Bill of Rights and French Revolution, that type of things, conceptualized rights as such, they are something that come only with the Enlightenment and after that.
Thank you so much, Heikki. I mean, so it's my turn. I have some comments and I mean, not questions, but maybe I took some notes actually, and I'm gonna say a few of them right here. Starting from the end, I guess. I think the focus of the project on police law is very important, I guess, because I mean you can look precisely for you look at local experiences. I mean, I totally agree with you when you say that comparing local experiences is not the only possibility of doing comparative legal history. But I think it is I mean a very important way to compare. And I was wondering, I mean, in which sense you use do you use the idea of police law? I mean, is I mean in the way of public administration of the local, I guess, yeah. So cleaning of the city, food supply, and
that type of things. Yeah, by the way, I have to add one very important thing to that. When I said what I said about the local things, of course, I mean police legislation, police regulation all over the place in Europe and in the colonies is also it comes from different levels, as you know, as we well know. It actually exists on every level where there are power holders. You have it in the Spanish system, for instance. You have it in Recopilación de las Indias. It comes from the king. It comes from the viceroys. It comes from the audiencias as well. At least in certain things, when it comes to organizing courts, and it comes from the cabildos. It comes from the very, very local level as well. So I have to take back a little bit if I sounded a little bit critical about getting local. Police regulation, you cannot avoid being a little bit local as well, because it's typical for police that it comes from all levels.
No, I understood your point, and I agree with you when you were planning a bigger comparative study or comparative project, and I think you were, my opinion, you were right in this perspective. I totally agree with you, but I wish to ask you about the criminal issue. What's the place of criminal issue in your opinion, on a comparative study of colonial experiences? And the other question, I have many others, but if you could answer these two, I can ask you if you have some time, a few others. And the place of the appeal system, if I can say that. The idea of jurisdiction, in a hierarchy between jurisdictions and judges and courts, and how could we look at colonial experiences, particularly precisely on appeal systems. Do you understand what I mean? I think it's because, for example, if you look at the British experience, you have I'm not a specialist on that point, but I think they have the colonial space have more autonomy, if I may say so. In jurisdiction matters than, for example, the Portuguese case. I'm not saying that a judicial claim, a civil claim on a village, on the village of Aquiraz, the case I study here in Ceará, could be judged in an appeal by the Casa de Explicação in Lisbon. Theoretically, it was possible. In a study I published 2 years ago, I tried to study the number of appeals that were originally from Brazil and that were reviewed by the Casa de Explicação. 2,000 claims in around 60 years. It's not. It is not. A huge number, but I think it is not something. It's a relevant number, but
it's a substantial number anyway.
Yeah. It's just civil claims. But if you compare with the Britain system, I'm not sure if there was a kind of central court that could review this. So these 2 points. If I'd like to hear you, the criminal law and criminal issues and the appeal system.
Yeah, well, starting from the appeal system, I think it's hugely relevant as a point of comparison in general, because it's really, of course, it's as appeal systems always, they are instruments of control. So the more easier it is to appeal, the more control. The appeal systems were not made so as to be nice to the subjects, so that they would have chances of correcting wrong decisions, but they were made to control, basically, if at all possible. There's by the way a good article by Richard Ross about this, which you may have read in the Cambridge History of American Law, where he compares the British and the Spanish system, and his main point is that the Spanish system allowed for much more appeals. Let's say that it was easier to appeal in the Spanish colonial system than in the British one, where it was virtually impossible to get your case to the Privy Council in London, which was the more or less the equivalent of Consejo de Indias in Spain. And Casa de Explicação, I think it's the Portuguese system is very, in this respect, maybe quite similar to Spain, I think. Probably, but this is just a rough guess. I don't know. You know better, I'm sure. But at least it seems to be closer to the Spanish system. Then, if you take the Dutch system, that's again a little bit closer to the British system, where it was practically not theoretically and completely impossible, but practically almost impossible to get your case heard to the high courts in Amsterdam. But on the other hand, there was a quite well functioning appeal system in Asia, in Batavia and over there. So they had their own quite well functioning appeals system. As to criminal law, well, that's a tough one. It's really most real criminal law is not part of our project as well, but I'm interested in it because it's my sort of like my old love, so to say. I started my legal history writing in criminal law, and I've always been interested in that. So, well, the way I see it is that it's really part of the jus commune. I don't really, the little that I know about the use of criminal law in the colonies, it doesn't seem to be that different, at least not theoretically that different from the criminal law in Europe. So because that wasn't something that was specifically made for the colonies. I mean, I'm talking about the structure of crime, for instance, the structure of the court proceedings, the inquisitional procedures in relation to the adversarial procedures, and all that stuff is more or less the same as it was in Europe. I think. I don't know how you see it. It would be interesting to hear, but. I don't think that's really something very specific for the colonies, at least not at a theoretical level. So,
yeah, I mean, when I asked you about criminal law, I was wondering about the materialization of criminal law in a local perspective. I'm turning back to the local point. For example, I have a letter from the Municipal Council of Olinda in Pernambuco, I guess 1678 or 1670s, I guess. They were they required they asked for the privilege of condemning and applying capital punishment for some guy. And then the answer of the Crown was. They said that only the Crown and the Crown Justice could apply capital punishment for criminal.
Yeah.
But there are many records of execution of criminals, So despite this, the disorder, and despite the jus commune and the national law. So it's interesting point to understand how these dynamics of local powers and Crown's power act and it's just a question because maybe I didn't know that criminal laws was not part of the project. But maybe I thought that maybe one of the guys that are there were working on this topic.
Not really, because it's such a different thing already. Of course, police regulation also had its very often criminal rules about punishment. Let's put it this way. But the real criminal law that you can that has to do with capital punishments and real crimes. That I think is a little bit of a different area. But it's interesting that they, if they really did that they sort of like went for harder punishments in your cases, because what often happens is that they go for more lenient punishments. If you think about, I'm not talking about colonies in general, but if you think about the history of criminal law in the early modern period, let's say in Europe, the usual story, of course, is that there may be death punishments in the law, but they're not observed in the local level. What they do in practice is they give them something else. They extradite people, or they give them whipping, or they put them to work in the salt mines or galleries or something like that. So this is the general story. So it would be interesting, of course, to compare that with the cases in Brazil, for instance. whether that is true to some extent, or whether it was always for the harder, or some of the both. I don't know.
Great. I mean, I have another question that, I mean, after your answer to, I guess, I'm not sure if it's to Luisa or to Delmiro, you've mentioned, I mean, this difference between the Spanish case and the other cases on thinking about a kind of different experience. I mean, when you mentioned, for example, Solorzano Pereira. I'd like to ask you your opinion about. I mean, what do you think is the the reason for? Did you have any opinion about that? I mean, what's the reason of this difference?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know, because I hate to admit it, but I only got this idea about 2 weeks ago. All of a sudden in the morning, I was brushing my teeth or something like that. I started to think about this. It's only in Spain that they have this literature. Am I really right? And then I went to work and I went through some books, and then I talked to the people in the project and I introduced them the idea as well. And well, they didn't at least say that I was completely wrong. So I guess I'm right. And I don't know. I think one reason could be that, well, first of all, the sheer size of legal literature. That's a practical reason, because I think there was much more legal literature in Spain, legal scholarship in Spain, than, for instance, in Portugal, probably. So that's one reason. It's not a very good reason, but it's some kind of a reason anyway. If you have more writers, some of them can afford to specialize on themes that you cannot afford to specialize if you're only fewer writers, maybe. But it's not a very good reason. But then another reason, which I think is a better one, has to do with the amount of specifically colonial legislation. If you have lots of it, as you had in Spain, again, more than in Portugal, in sheer numbers, I'm talking about statutes given for the different colonies. If you have lots of them, a huge number, you will need people who make sense of it, lawyers who write about it. You will need Solorzano Pereira, you will need Eusebio Bolaños, and you will need other people who write on different aspects of that legislation. Whereas if you don't have quite that much, and you have a smaller number of scholars in general, then maybe that type of a literature just does not develop, something like that. However, that really doesn't explain the case of the Dutch case at all. I don't know, because they had quite a lot of universities, a lot of legal scholarship, but no colonial legal scholarship, even though they had quite a lot of colonies as well. Portugal only had one university. The United Provinces had, I don't know, 10, at least 5 to 10, but something like that. I haven't counted them, but there were many universities. So, and then thinking about, well, Britain is of course a very different case, because legal scholarship in general did not play really a big role there until in the 19th century. So that's explainable that way, I think. But so as you can see, I don't really have a very good answer. Not just some kind of idea.
Do you think that, I mean, the model of circulation, if I may say, of legal culture in Spanish experience and Portuguese experience could explain that? I mean, maybe universities.
Absolutely.
I mean, the first name I think, I mean, chronologically was Juan de Matienzo, for example, who was a oidor in Lima, 1550s, I guess, or I mean, so in Portuguese case, it didn't happen, and the circulation was, I think, even more restrict than in Spanish case, I guess. So.
I think that's definitely probably part of the reason that in the Spanish, in the Portuguese universe, the lawyers circulated, as Nuno Camarines has shown very well. They went from all over the place, and they were more or less like diplomats almost, that they were transferred from place to place, and they probably never acquired the same kind of an expertise, one might suspect, as did, for instance, Solórzano when he was for many years in the Indies, or Matienzo, or practically all of those who wrote these treatises. They were really, really good experts on what they wrote about. Maybe the Portuguese system did not produce similar kind of expertise, because they had to be sort of like generalists. They had to, in many cases, know a lot about everything. So that might be part of the reason.
Does anyone else like to ask another question? I think we still have, a couple of minutes. Not a lot, but
Absolutely. If there are questions or comments,
feel free. Or
I was thinking on how we could see the regimes and the stabilization of local peculiarities, using these the governance and the policies we are looking at the project as an axe of this, of the idea of the regimes. Okay, because of course I'm fanatic with the idea of regimes, and I'm trying to see regimes everywhere. But I see many similarities in the way of you were. Now I think today I saw more on the proximities of what Thomas has been developing with this idea of this stabilization at some point.
Yeah.
And how you're seeing things locally, but not only locally. Now we are seeing it also with a global, let's say the global behind it. But today it made me think more about the similarities, more similarities today with the regimes and the ideas you are using in the project. Or the presentations now, and it made more sense. Yeah, but still, the regimes, we are still really figuring out how to apply.
Yeah, but it's a wonderful theory. Really, I like it very much. I think the good thing about it is that it's at the same time theoretical, but it's also a practical tool.
Yeah.
It gets us rid of this legal pluralism mess, which is a really not very helpful at all. So in that way, even though I know, of course, it's still work in progress as well, but and it's going to develop. But it's a very good start, I think.
Well, in the conference, we are trying to figure out about the idea of stabilization. So the conference is about legal change, because I think that's the point where we still have to develop a little bit more and to think about when can we say that something is stabilized, and we can analyze and we can compare and we can study.
Yeah.
So they get to make the conference about legal change just more or less because of this.
Yeah.
Because of the.
Yeah, I can understand that, because on the other hand, you might easily say that everything is in constant state of change. Everything is changing all the time. So when does it stabilize? But I guess it does. Sometimes some things do stabilize.
Maybe what you said in the beginning, like when you compare, you make this predefinition of what you are comparing, and when you are comparing and what you are comparing. So maybe this is a kind of this, I don't know, this like this idea of Thomas of the photography that we take to try to understand what actually happened in the past somehow to give it a meaning in a language, to explain a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess he departs from some kind of or you in the project, from some kind of a snapshot picture. You take kind of like a snapshot, and you try to catch all the normativities at that very moment that are at work in that picture.
Yeah, practices.
Hoping that they are stabilized, and they're not just tangent, just passing away, something like that.
That's the difficult, because it cannot be stabilized, not even in one day.
Yeah.
So
But it's worth the trouble, definitely, to think about it, I'm sure.
So
Very nice.
let's see if we can answer this in the book.
Yeah.
See, Gustavo is also writing about it. So let's see. Let's see.
Yeah, wonderful.
In 2 weeks, we're gonna discuss it. So let's see.
Well, good luck. I'm sure you can find some very good answers. Cannot be impossible.
We will see. It's a bit difficult.
Yeah.
But we will see. We'll see. And Natalie is gonna be there too. So we are going to put together.
Is Natalie coming there?
No, not coming. She's gonna be via Zoom.
In Zoom. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Just Zoom. Some of the our guests could not come because of visa, blah 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 blah. Yeah. So we decided to make it hybrid. I think health is coming, and health will be via Zoom.
Right. Well, it's wonderful that she's participating. That's very good news. I didn't know about that, but I'm really happy if she can do that. Wonderful.
Because we started this some months last year, right? In almost 1 year ago, we started the project to write about this.
Yeah.
To write this book, and she already presented something by.
That's right. She was there in the first meeting. Yeah, that's a nice way to write a book, by the way.
We started there. We started discussing the abstracts, and it was a extended abstract, and then we have a seminar, the seminar on legal change, 6-month seminars, and then we're going to have now the final conference with the drafts done, ready. And then 10 years later, the book will come out.
Maybe a little bit earlier. But it's a nice, untraditional way of making a book.
No,
that.
No. I hope it will be very soon.
I'm sure.
Good.
Okay. Well, just before closing, I have only one. I mean, it's not a question. You've mentioned the name of a Dutch legal historian. I couldn't get it about Dutch. No, sorry, Danish.
Oh, Ditlev Tam. Can I? Is there a chat here in this system? Let's see.
Can you see? I mean, it's the fifth button on the right side.
You're right. Yeah. Right side.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. I'm writing it here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And then if Ditlev Tam.
He's published at least one of those articles in the Actas of Derecho Indiano. That's the place to look for them.
Ditlev is also a very interesting person, and he loves women's and gender legal history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know.
He's a wonderful person. He's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's not a very ordinary person, for sure.
No. No, it's really worth even writing message with exchanging message, and he's wonderful.
Yeah.
And if you still have 2 minutes, I promise it is the last question. The last question I ask you. I mean, among the points of comparison, if I say so, you've mentioned police law, indigenous law, if I may say, and you've mentioned the statute theory of law. If you could just back to this point and just a little bit, thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's there's a book about that. What's the classical author? There's a thick book, a thick German book about Statutentheorie by Wolfgang. Let's see. I have to Google. I'm missing the name. Just a moment. Statutentheorie. Wolfgang Wiegand, student. I can, let's see, here it comes. I'll put it in the chat, and then I can explain a little bit. Just a moment. Where's my... There you are. Okay. And here's the Wolfgang Wiegand. Yeah. So it's from 1977, if I remember right. And it's more or less the medieval theory as it was developed in northern Italy. And it's the whole idea is that in Italy, what it meant was that you had, when you had a legal problem, you basically took the city law as your starting point. That was your starting point always. And of course, the city laws did not entail everything because they did not put everything there. And then, or there were lacunae or whatever. And if you didn't find the answer, so theoretically, you were supposed to go to the next sphere, maybe the Duchy of Tuscany or something like that, whatever it was, and then you would go to the next sphere, as many as there were theoretically, until you reached jus commune, which was sort of like the last safety net. This is actually the general theory, more or less, of jus commune, but it's statuten theory in this German, or actually originally Italian theory, more or less. And this is something that is then adopted all over the place in the jus commune theory. And also, I think somebody has written about this in the colonial context as well. I just do not remember the name of the guy. It's a Chilean old school legal historian. Who might that be? It's not Bernardino Bravoliro, but it's the other one.
Javier Barrientos?
No, not Javier Barrientos. He's written about jus commune, very valuable things as well. But it's the older generation guy. I think he died a few years back. He's written about this because Spain also had the same idea in theory, and Sweden had it, and everybody basically had it. But as I said, this is theory. Practice was different. And Peter Östman's book on the German system, for instance, shows quite clearly that what the advocates, for instance, did was they did not follow this at all when they took cases to rise Kammergericht, to the Imperial Chamber Court. They just carried all the sources that they had there at the same time, which is logical. They didn't try to, use this theory. They used all the laws that supported their case, and more or less the same in my cases in Livonia. That's the way it went. But in theory, it was like this.
All right. Heikki, thank you so much for your time and for coming here. It was a pleasure. I mean, I've learned a lot with your talk and with your answers and comments. And I think everybody here also had the same feeling of we are even more curious about the results of the project. I think it would be the results. I mean, it's impossible to have a final result for sure, but I mean the contributions the project will provide us all who study the colonial experiences, naming that colonial or not, but looking at those experiences. And so thank you so much. Thank you so much for this afternoon in Brazil and this evening in Helsinki.
No, thank you, Gustavo. It was my pleasure. Definitely very nice. And I promise the next time I will speak in Portuguese.
Thank you so much. And I promise next time you come here to Fortaleza, I guess.
Okay.
Boa noite, Gustavo, for organizing, and a pleasure, a big pleasure to hear Heikki.
Yeah, it was very nice. And enjoy your conference in Frankfurt.
Will.
Okay, boa noite.
Thank you so
Boa
much.
noite.
Boa noite. Tchau, tchau.